The wind hadn't stopped in 3 days, not even once. It screamed across the open plains of Wyoming like a devil unchained, lifting sheets of snow so dense they turned daylight into a dull gray haze. On the third night, when the lanterns in town flickered out and doors were bolted shut, most folks huddled deep in their cabins with their backs against the walls and every blanket they owned piled on top of them. But 23 miles out from the nearest warm fire, one cowboy crouched behind the busted remains of a hay wagon, with nothing but a canvas coat, a half-empty canteen, and a lantern glowing like a lone eye in the storm. His name was Elijah McGraw, 27 years old, a wrangler mostly. Some said he was a bit touched in the head for taking jobs alone in winter. Others said he just preferred not to be around people. Either way, he wasn't like the other cowboys who rode in with the season and drifted out again. Elijah stuck around, lived cheap, worked hard, didn't say much, kept to himself unless someone asked about cattle, fences, or weather. Then he'd talk your ear off. But there was one thing nobody could argue. He was still alive after the blizzard of 42, when 24 others weren't. And it wasn't luck, it was that lantern. See, the story starts earlier that winter, late December, when Elijah took a contract to drive 40 head of longhorn from the Salt Wells Basin north to the Laramie foothills. Not an unusual job, but the timing was wrong. Most cowboys would have turned it down. A December trail drive through Wyoming was asking for trouble, but Elijah took it anyway. Said he needed the money. Said he had a trick that would keep him warm, no matter what. Nobody believed him. When he mentioned the lantern, a few men laughed, others just stared. He didn't explain, just packed his kit and saddled up. The cattle drive started like most did, cold mornings, slow going, and too many nights sleeping with a rifle across his chest. By the time he crossed Bitter Creek, the snow had already started coming down. Steady flurries, nothing too serious, not yet. Then on January 4th, a storm rolled down from the Wind River Range like a punishment from God. It moved fast and violent, blowing in from the north with wind that stung through coats and ice that clung to horses' manes like it was trying to freeze them mid-stride. Elijah had made it halfway through a shallow canyon when the first white wall hit. His horse stumbled, the cattle scattered, visibility dropped to a few yards. No one in their right mind would have kept moving, but Elijah didn't panic. He dismounted, unstrapped his gear, and pulled out the lantern. Now here's where things get strange. Most men in a blizzard would dig down, build a windbreak, maybe start a fire if they had the time. Elijah didn't do any of that. He set the lantern in the snow, lit it, and started digging. Not into the earth, but into his saddlebags. Out came 3 things: a length of oilskin tarp, a coil of iron wire, and a small tin can he called his warm box. The whole setup took him 20 minutes to rig, even with his fingers going stiff from the cold. When he was done, he had what looked like a crude little tent made from canvas and wire, with the lantern burning inside and the warm box just behind it, half buried in snow. Elijah crawled in, turned the lantern low, and waited. And somehow, it worked. He stayed inside that contraption for the next 20 hours while the blizzard raged around him. Temperatures dropped to 30 below. Wind gusts hit 60 miles an hour. When the storm finally passed, ranchers found 5 cattle dead in a nearby gully. A supply wagon had overturned and frozen solid. One of the drivers was found face down in the snow, just a mile from shelter. But Elijah McGraw stepped out of his snow lantern shelter, stretched his arms, and started wrangling the survivors back into line. At first, people thought he was lying, said no lantern could keep a man alive in that cold. But he wasn't just alive. He was healthy, no frostbite, no numb fingers, just a windburned face and a hoarse voice. The story spread fast. Elijah didn't brag about it, just kept working. But over the next few years, folks started asking questions. What was the trick? What did he know that they didn't? Turns out Elijah had been thinking about cold for a long time. He wasn't some half-wit wanderer with a lucky break. Back in Texas, before the trail life, he'd worked in a railroad crew laying track through winter terrain. That's where he'd seen the old section men use lantern heat in ways that made no sense to him at the time. Melting ice inside wooden boxes, drying boots inside sealed pits, using radiant heat to warm up shovels and crowbars before they froze to hands. One old Swede in particular, Jonas Nilsson, taught Elijah something he never forgot. "It's not the fire," Jonas used to say. "It's how you trap the warmth." That idea stuck. Elijah played with it in his head for years, thinking through how you could survive cold without relying on big roaring fires or heavy insulation. Fires needed fuel, blankets got wet, but a lantern, small, steady, controlled. If you built a space small enough and sealed it right, the lantern didn't just give light, it could change the temperature of the air inside, not by much, just a few degrees. But in a place where the outside was 40 below, 5 degrees could be the difference between life and death. So Elijah started experimenting. The warm box was the first piece, a simple tin box with stones inside, heated slowly by proximity to the lantern. The stones would radiate warmth even after the lantern went out. The oilskin tent was the second breakthrough. Tight weave, waterproof, and small enough to hold body heat. The wire frame? That was just to keep it off his face. He wasn't trying to build a tent. He was building a bubble, a tiny, sealed environment, where heat didn't escape as fast as it was generated. He practiced, tested it in milder storms, figured out how long the oil in the lantern would last, how to angle the box so condensation didn't drip on him, how to tuck his boots beside the warm box without melting the soles. It was part science, part obsession. Most cowboys didn't have time for that kind of tinkering. Elijah made time because he knew, sooner or later, he'd be out in something worse than a Wyoming snow flurry. And he was right. But survival wasn't the end of the story. What happened after that blizzard is what turned Elijah's trick from a weird footnote into something people started copying. Because less than 2 weeks after that storm, another one rolled in. This one bigger, meaner, longer. Elijah had made it back to the Draper Ranch by then, just in time to help them dig out from the first hit. When the second storm started, he didn't wait. He gathered every ranch hand, every drifter, every person still on the trail, and taught them how to build his lantern shelters. They cobbled together tarps, wire frames, heated bricks in stove ovens, and buried lanterns in snow hollows. And it worked. Not perfectly. A few folks still got frostbite. One young hand fell asleep too close to the warm box and scorched his coat. But nobody died. Not a single person. In a storm that took 40 lives across the territory, the Draper Ranch community made it through without a funeral. That's when they stopped calling Elijah crazy. But that's only the beginning. Because as word spread about the lantern trick, so did rumors. About where Elijah learned it, how he tested it, and what he did during his time alone in the high country. Some say he went half mad from cold and hunger the year before and invented the shelter as a kind of fever dream. Others claim he learned it from a Lakota woman who'd once saved his life. And one man swears Elijah had died in a storm once and came back different. What really happened during the winter of 41 is a story few know in full, but the clues are there, in an abandoned line shack at the edge of Dry Bone Canyon, in journal pages found years later under floorboards, in the strange iron ring Elijah wore around his neck every winter, and in the way he refused to light a fire inside any cabin he built after that year. And it all comes back to that night behind the hay wagon, when he sat inside a lantern-lit cocoon of canvas and wire, while the blizzard howled like a dying animal across the plains. Before the blizzard of 42 made him a legend, Elijah McGraw spent a winter that nearly broke him. The kind of season that stripped a man down to bone and willpower, left him staring into the wind, wondering if he'd live to see another sunrise. That was the winter of 41, the one nobody in Wyoming wanted to remember, but nobody ever forgot. It came earlier than anyone expected, and stayed longer than seemed possible. It was the kind of cold that made wood snap like glass and turned the breath in your lungs into a ghost hanging in front of you. And it was that winter that taught Elijah everything he needed to know about surviving the next one. He'd been driving cattle for the Harper outfit that season, working the high ridges between Rawlins and the North Platte. It was lonely country, treeless stretches broken only by sagebrush and the bones of old buffalo. The crew was small, 5 men, all half frozen by mid-November. When the first snows came, most of them headed south to lower ground, but Elijah stayed behind to finish repairing the line shack near the ridge. He said he'd only be a few days. No one argued. He had his horse, supplies for a week, and a stubborn streak wide as the horizon. The storm hit on the second night. No warning, no slow build, just a wall of white, and a sound like the sky ripping open. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in his coffee froze before he finished drinking it. His horse bolted before dawn, spooked by the wind, and vanished into the dark. By morning, Elijah was alone, half buried in snow, with the roof of the line shack groaning under the weight. The fire he'd built inside the stone hearth smoked more than it burned. He kept feeding it wood, but the heat seemed to vanish the second it left the flames. He wrapped himself in blankets, sat with his back to the wall, and listened to the wind hammering the cabin. By the third day, he ran out of dry wood. Everything outside was frozen solid, impossible to split. The cold crept in through the floorboards and walls like a living thing. The frost on the inside of the windows was thick enough to scrape with a knife. Elijah had seen cold before, but nothing like that. He felt it working its way inward, first his toes, then his hands, then deeper. He couldn't keep the fire going without fuel, and without fire, he wouldn't make it through another night. That's when he saw the lantern hanging on a nail near the door. It was an old railway lantern, dented, rusted, half the glass cracked. He'd taken it from a foreman years earlier, kept it mostly as a keepsake. He stared at it for a long time, his mind running slow from the cold. Then he remembered something, a story that old Swede, Jonas Nilsson, had told him back on the railroad crew. Jonas used to say that during the long Scandinavian winters, men could sleep through the night in wooden huts, barely bigger than coffins, if they sealed the cracks and burned a lantern inside. Not for light, Jonas had said, for living. You trap your breath, your heat, the lamp's warmth. It's enough if you don't waste it. It sounded crazy then, but in that frozen cabin, with frost forming on his mustache and his fingers turning white, Elijah figured crazy was worth trying. He tore apart the bunk frame for wood, then used the planks to box in the hearth, closing off the front with whatever scraps he could find. He stuffed the cracks with his spare socks, strips of cloth, anything to slow the airflow. He poured the last of his lamp oil into the lantern, lit it, and set it inside the makeshift box. The light filled the small space with a soft orange glow. Then he crouched in front of it, pulled his blankets tight, and waited. At first, nothing changed. The wind still howled, the cold still bit. But after an hour, he noticed something strange. The air directly around him didn't hurt to breathe anymore. His fingertips, numb and useless before, began to tingle painfully as blood returned. The frost on his coat collar melted and dripped. He could smell warm metal from the lantern's frame. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elijah realized he wasn't warming the cabin. He was warming the air pocket he sat in, a tiny bubble of heat trapped and recycled by his breath and the lantern's flame. The smoke and exhaust vented weakly through cracks above, but the heat stayed. He fed it with whatever oil he had, rationing every drop. When the flame dimmed, he leaned closer, hands cupped around the glass, whispering to it like it could hear him. For 3 nights, he lived inside that box of light. The wind never stopped. Snow buried the windows, sealing him in completely. He heard the roof crack once and thought it was the end, but it held. He slept in short bursts, woke to feed the flame, and talked to it like a friend. When the storm finally broke on the 6th day, he crawled out of the cabin blinking like a man seeing the world for the first time. The snowdrifts were taller than a man. His horse was gone. His skin was raw and blistered from cold burns, but he was alive. He made it back to camp 2 days later, walking on half-dead feet. The other men couldn't believe it. They said no one could have survived that long without firewood. Elijah didn't argue. He just kept that old lantern close and said little, but he never forgot what it had done. That winter changed him. He started studying how warmth behaved. Every cabin he repaired, he tested, stuffed rags into cracks, lit lanterns inside boxes, measured how long it took frost to form again. He wasn't a scientist, but he was methodical. He made notes on scraps of paper, crude diagrams showing airflow through rooms, the way smoke curled near ceilings, how quickly a candle died in certain corners. He talked to travelers and traders about the cold, about how they slept, what they burned, what they wore. By the time spring came, Elijah had a theory. It wasn't about fire or fuel, it was about containment. You didn't need to fight the cold with more heat. You needed to stop losing the heat you already had. That simple shift in thinking became his obsession. He started carrying rolls of oilcloth, wire, bits of tin, and glass lenses in his gear. Other cowboys joked that he was turning into a tinker, but they stopped laughing when they saw what he could do with it. During the summer of 41, Elijah disappeared into the high country alone. Said he wanted to test something. He packed light, food for 2 weeks, tools, and that same battered lantern. When he came back a month later, he looked thinner but sharper, like a man who'd been through revelation. He said little about what he'd found, but his gear had changed. His lantern was modified, the vent holes narrower, the glass tinted with soot to reduce glare, and a thin layer of tin foil behind the flame to reflect heat forward. He'd attached a hook underneath the frame to hang a small metal canister. When asked what it was for, he said, "That's where I keep the sun." Nobody knew what he meant, but it became the running joke around camp. The man who bottled sunlight, the crazy cowboy with his magic lamp. Elijah didn't care. He kept experimenting. By autumn, he'd built what he called the warm box, a flat tin container filled with river stones and lined with copper foil. When he placed it under the lantern for a few hours, the stones absorbed the heat. Even after the lantern went out, the stones stayed warm enough to thaw frozen boots or melt ice in a cup. He carried it everywhere. Then came November, and another test. He rode north with a supply train bound for Independence Rock. They got caught in an early frost that killed 2 horses and froze their water barrels solid overnight. The men panicked, trying to build fires in the open wind. The flames blew out every time. Elijah told them to stop wasting matches. He set his lantern behind a boulder, put the warm box beside it, and threw a piece of canvas over the two. Within minutes, he'd created a pocket of still air where frost wouldn't form. He showed them how to crawl in beside it, seal the edges, and breathe slowly. They stayed alive through the night. By morning, one man called it a miracle. Another called it witchcraft. Elijah just called it common sense. But he also knew something was missing. The lantern trick worked for one man, maybe 2, but it couldn't save a group. He needed a bigger bigger version, something that could keep multiple people alive without suffocating them. He spent that winter refining it. He built frames from willow branches, shaped tarps into cones, and experimented with smoke vents made from tin cups. He learned how to angle the lantern so the flame burned steady even in gusts. He learned how to insulate the ground beneath with animal hides and snow layers instead of dirt. And he discovered something important. Snow, when packed tight enough, wasn't just cold. It was an insulator. It trapped air, which meant it could trap heat too. That realization was the turning point. He began constructing what looked like inverted nests, small snow mounds hollowed from the inside, lined with canvas and warmed by his lantern and box setup. It was claustrophobic, barely big enough to sit upright, but inside it felt like another world. The air was still, the walls glowed faintly from reflected light, and the temperature rose high enough to melt the frost off his mustache. For the first time, he understood what Jonas Nilsson had meant all those years ago. It's not the fire, it's the trapping. When spring thaw came, Elijah rode into Laramie with a new conviction. He started sketching his designs on paper, rough and clumsy but clear enough to show others. Some merchants thought he was onto something, offered to pay him to demonstrate it, but Elijah turned them down. "It ain't for money," he said. "It's for living." That fall, when the Harper outfit needed a driver to move cattle north again, Elijah signed on without hesitation. The men joked that he'd freeze with his fancy lamp, but he knew better. He'd built his shelter, refined it, and tested it in wind and sleet. The following January would prove if it truly worked. And when the storm of 42 came roaring down from the mountains, it did. But the price of that proof wasn't small, because what most people don't know, what Elijah never told anyone, is that he wasn't alone during that storm. There was another rider with him that night, a ranch hand named Caleb Barnes, who didn't live to tell the tale. And it was Caleb's death that turned Elijah's trick from an experiment into an act of desperation, and then into legend. When the storm of 42 struck, Elijah McGraw wasn't riding alone. He'd taken on a younger hand named Caleb Barnes, a 19-year-old rancher's son from Kansas, with more enthusiasm than sense. The boy had been eager to prove himself, bragging that he could handle any trail in the territory. Elijah hadn't planned to bring him along, but Caleb's father had begged him to, said the boy needed to learn from someone careful, someone who'd come back from the high country when others didn't. Elijah didn't say yes out of charity. He said yes because he remembered being 19 once, all confidence and no caution, and he figured maybe the boy would learn something that might keep him alive longer than most cowhands lasted. They left Draper Ranch 3 days before the blizzard. The job was simple enough: haul supplies to a line shack up on Goose Ridge and check that the cattle driven there earlier hadn't wandered. It was supposed to be 2 days out, 1 day's work, 2 days back. A short trip for men who'd spent half their lives in the saddle. The first day was clear. Bright sky, hard frost, wind out of the west. Elijah rode ahead, checking for drifts, while Caleb whistled and talked too much. He talked about home, about his mother's bread, about the girl he'd left behind, about how he was going to buy his own herd by 25. He asked questions faster than Elijah could answer. Why do the cattle bunch like that before snow? Why does the sky look different out here? Why don't you ever smile? Elijah just grunted and kept riding. By the second day, the sky had changed. Clouds rolled down from the Wind River peaks, heavy and low, with that dull green tint that meant trouble. The wind shifted north, carrying a bitter edge. Elijah stopped at midday and looked out over the valley, feeling the air in his throat. "We need to hole up," he said. "Tonight's gonna be rough," Caleb laughed. "A little snow won't kill us, will it?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He studied the boy's horse, sweat freezing on its flanks, nostrils crusted white. "Not if we're smart," he finally said. They made camp in a small draw, half sheltered by rocks. Elijah gathered snow and packed it against the windward side of their tents to seal the gaps. Caleb built a fire that smoked more than it burned. The wind kept shifting, spitting flakes so fine they looked like sand. By dusk, the temperature had plunged below zero. Caleb tried to joke as he rubbed his hands over the weak flames. "Cold enough for ya?" Elijah just nodded, checking his lantern and the small tin box he carried everywhere now. He'd filled it with stones from the creek bed earlier that day, let it sit beside the fire to absorb what warmth it could. When the wind gusted and nearly snuffed the flames, he covered the fire with his coat and spoke low. "When it goes out, and it will, don't panic. Stay near the lantern. It's all that'll keep us breathing if this keeps up." Caleb frowned, confused. A lantern? That little thing? You mean your crazy trick folks talk about? Elijah didn't look up. It ain't crazy if it works. That night, the storm hit full force. Wind screamed through the canyon like a living creature. The fire died before midnight. Snow buried the tents, pressed the canvas down until it sagged against their heads. Elijah could feel the cold seeping through his boots like knives. He lit the lantern, set it inside the small frame he'd built, and pulled the oilskin tarp over them both, sealing it as best he could. The air inside warmed almost immediately, faint but real, enough to sting the skin as blood returned. Caleb crawled closer, shivering violently. "What now?" he asked through chattering teeth. "Now we wait," Elijah said. Hours passed. The wind howled like a beast clawing at the earth. Snow piled higher and higher outside, muffling the world. Inside the lantern shelter, the air stayed just warm enough to keep them alive. The light flickered gold against the canvas walls, throwing long shadows across their faces. Elijah dozed in fits, waking every hour to trim the wick, adjust the vent, and check the oil level. Caleb kept talking in a half-dreaming voice about Kansas summers, about swimming in creeks, about heat so strong you could fry eggs on stones. Near dawn, Elijah noticed the lantern flame guttering low. The oil was almost gone. He had enough for maybe another hour. The storm outside didn't sound like it was slowing. He weighed his options: conserve what little light they had, or let it burn and risk freezing in the dark. Caleb must have seen the worry on his face. "We're not gonna die, are we?" Elijah hesitated. "Not if we keep thinking." "What do you mean?" He pointed to the warm box beneath the lantern. "Those stones'll hold heat for a while after the flame goes out. We use them smart. We can make it through till the wind drops." "How long?" Elijah shrugged. "Long enough, maybe, if you don't waste breath talking." Caleb laughed weakly. "You always this friendly?" But Elijah didn't answer. He was listening, not to the boy, not to the wind, but to the faint cracking sounds around them. The snowpack was shifting, too heavy. He'd seen avalanches before, knew that deep, groaning creak of compacted layers ready to give way. They were buried in a drawer with steep sides, exactly where you didn't want to be when snow decided to move. He leaned forward and whispered, "Quiet." The sound came again, a deep, muffled whoomp. The ground seemed to breathe beneath them. Then silence. Elijah knew that silence too well. He shoved the lantern aside, ripped open the tarp, and grabbed Caleb's coat. "Out!" he shouted. They barely made it 2 steps before the world collapsed. The hillside above them broke loose with a roar that drowned everything. Snow, ice, rocks, all tumbling down in a wave of white. It hit them like a freight train, lifted them off their feet, buried them alive. The light from the lantern vanished. For a long moment, there was only pressure, weight, darkness. Elijah couldn't breathe. He clawed upward, but the snow packed tighter with every movement. Panic surged, the kind that comes from knowing you're dying and can't stop it. Then something hit his face. Cloth, the tarp. He bit down on it, found a pocket of air, forced himself to breathe slow. Minutes passed, maybe hours. He couldn't tell. When he finally managed to move, he found Caleb wedged against him, still alive but barely conscious. The boy's eyes were open, pupils wide in the dim light filtering through the snow above. "Elijah? I'm here," he said. His voice sounded strange in the cramped space. "Don't move too much. You'll close the air pocket. We're buried, ain't we?" "Yeah. What do we do?" Elijah felt around, searching for the lantern. He found it half crushed, glass shattered, but the warm box was still there. The stones inside were faintly warm, not hot, just above freezing, but enough to keep his fingers moving. He pressed one into Caleb's palm. "Hold that. Don't drop it. Keep it near your chest." Caleb nodded weakly. "You think someone'll find us?" Elijah didn't answer. Nobody was coming. The trail was long buried, and even if by some miracle riders came through, they'd never see the mound of snow that covered them. It was up to him now, his wits, his lungs, and what was left of that heat. He remembered what the old Swede had said. "It's not the fire, it's the trapping." So he did what instinct and experience told him to. He tore strips from his coat lining and stuffed them around the edges of their little air pocket, sealing it tighter. Every breath warmed it a fraction more. The snow itself insulated them, holding the little heat their bodies and the stones gave off. Slowly, painfully, the panic faded into a strange, exhausted calm. He lost track of time. Maybe 10 hours passed, maybe more. At one point, Caleb stopped shivering. His breathing grew shallow. Elijah tried to keep him awake, slapped his face, shouted, but the boy's head lolled. "Don't you quit on me," Elijah muttered. He pressed the last warm stone against Caleb's chest and held it there. The heat was fading fast. Elijah closed his eyes, whispering to the cold like it was a living thing he had to bargain with. "You got your fill already," he said softly. "You ain't taking another." At some point, exhaustion took him. He drifted in and out of half-dreams, hearing wind, then silence, then voices that weren't there. When he woke again, there was light, faint blue above, seeping through the snow. The storm had passed. He dug upward with numb hands, clawing through the crust until daylight broke in a blinding flash. Air flooded in. He dragged himself out first, then dug for Caleb. When he found the boy, he knew right away. Caleb's eyes were open but empty. The warmth stone still clutched in his hand had gone cold. Elijah sat beside him for a long time, not speaking. The sun hung low, pale and distant. The wind was quiet now, whispering through the drifts like a ghost. He closed Caleb's eyes, took the boy's hat, and buried him there in the snow. No marker, no cross, just a mound shaped by wind and memory. When Elijah finally stood, his body ached from cold and grief. He looked down at the crushed lantern in his hand. The glass was gone, but the metal frame still caught the light, dull and scarred. He wrapped it in cloth and tied it around his neck with a piece of wire, a reminder or maybe a warning. From that day on, he never went into the mountains without it, and he never lit another open fire inside a cabin. He rode back to Draper Ranch alone 2 days later. His face was wind-burned, his lips cracked, his eyes hollow. The ranch hands stared at him like he'd come back from the grave. When they asked where Caleb was, Elijah just said he didn't make it. Then he walked into the barn, sat down by the lantern light, and didn't speak for hours. Over the next weeks, he rebuilt his shelter design, this time with everything he'd learned burned into his memory. He added safety vents to prevent suffocation, stronger frames to keep snow from crushing the top, and he began showing others how to build them right. He didn't charge money, didn't care about credit. He just said, "If it gets bad, remember the light." That winter, when the second blizzard hit and wiped out half the county, his trick saved more than a few souls. Ranchers later swore they saw faint glows moving through the snow that night, little lantern lights bobbing in the white, marking the shelters he'd built for those who listened. Others said those who hadn't listened were found frozen, arms stretched toward where the lights had been. People started calling the glow McGraw's lanterns. Some swore they still saw them years later, when storms rolled across the plains, dim orange sparks drifting in the dark, vanishing when you got close. Elijah never spoke about that night again, but the iron ring he'd tied around his neck stayed there until the day he died. When a neighbor found his body years later, sitting in front of a cold stove, that same rusted frame hung against his chest, and the lantern glass somehow was whole again. After the winter of '42, Elijah McGraw became a name that traveled farther than the trails he'd ridden. At first, the story moved slow. A whisper passed from ranch hand to ranch hand, told low around campfires or during coffee breaks in frozen barns. They said there was a cowboy up in the mountains who survived a 3-day blizzard with nothing but a busted lantern and a box of hot rocks. Said he crawled out of the snow, looking half dead but warm, carried a boy's body on his back 20 miles, and never once cursed the cold. By the spring thaw, those whispers had turned into something harder, something more permanent, a kind of legend. Elijah didn't talk about it. When folks asked, he'd just nod once and go back to his work. But people watched him now, watched how he packed his saddle, how he chose campsites, how he built a windbreak with a flick of the wrist that seemed to turn bone-chilling wind into a lazy breeze. He was no longer just the quiet hand with strange habits. He was the man who had tricked death with a lantern. But Elijah hadn't tricked anything. He'd studied it, lived it, endured it, and what he'd learned in that blizzard didn't end when the snow melted. It became the foundation for everything he did from then on. He couldn't stop thinking about it, not just the survival part, but the possibilities. How many lives could be saved if others understood the principles he'd discovered, if they stopped thinking of warmth as something to burn, and instead something to trap, conserve, and reflect? In the months that followed, Elijah began writing it all down. He'd never kept journals before, said he didn't see the point in scribbling down the past when the trail was always ahead. But something changed after Caleb died. He started sketching diagrams in the margins of newspaper clippings, scribbling ideas on old feed bags, annotating books borrowed from passing school teachers and circuit riders. Most of it was crude, scrawled sentences, uneven lines, oil stains across half the pages, but the thoughts behind them were sharp, calculated. One of the ranch hands at Draper said Elijah kept his Bible tucked in his saddlebag, a ledger book full of weather notations, warmth retention tests, and lists of materials that could be scavenged from barns, sheds, or abandoned line shacks. He recorded how long different rocks held heat, which kinds of oils burned slowest, how canvas reacted to wind shear, what thickness of snow packed best for insulating shelters. He was building a science from scratch, using only what he could test with his hands and trust with his life. It wasn't long before others began copying his methods. At first it was small things. Men started carrying lanterns even during the day, saying it was good luck. Some started packing flat stones in their saddlebags, just in case. Then came the larger shifts. Ranchers built small lean-tos with oilskin roofs and lantern hooks. Line cabins were retrofitted with low ceilings and interior hearths designed to hold heat rather than bleed it through the roof. Someone in Casper started selling McGraw kits, little bundles with canvas, wire, and a reprinted version of Elijah's diagrams, lifted from a crumpled note he'd left behind in a supply shop. Elijah didn't profit from any of it. He didn't want to. When asked why he didn't sell his designs, he shrugged. "Ain't mine to sell," he said once. "Snow's not mine, heat's not mine. I just listen better than most." That humility only deepened the mystery around him. Folks began to embellish the story, said he could smell snow coming a day in advance, said he'd once thawed a frozen mule with just a lantern and a wet blanket, that he never lit fires anymore because fire was wasteful, a dying man's comfort instead of a living man's tool. But those who knew him well knew better. Elijah wasn't magical. He was meticulous. He studied like a scientist and lived like a ghost. After that winter, he turned down almost every job that took him through settled country. Instead, he traveled between the high valleys, offering to help trappers, homesteaders, and wandering drifters who were facing their first winter alone. He didn't preach, didn't lecture, just showed up, helped build a windbreak, taught a better way to hang canvas, left behind a handful of oiled stones, and moved on. Sometimes he'd stay a few nights, long enough to explain why lanterns worked better than campfires in snowbound valleys, how to dig a snow cave without collapsing the roof, or how to keep your breath from freezing your bedroll. Then he'd vanish again. One rancher said Elijah visited them during a bad freeze in '45, helped them rig a greenhouse frame with oiled canvas to trap heat for their calves. Saved the whole spring crop, he said. Didn't even ask for beans in return. Others claimed he'd walk 20 miles just to bring someone a better wick for their lantern. Then came the rumors, not just about Elijah's survival methods, but about Elijah himself. Some said he hadn't aged a day since the blizzard, that he still looked 30 even as the years passed, and men he'd worked alongside were stooped and grey. Others claimed he'd been seen out in storms that killed search parties, walking upright, lantern in hand, snow whipping around him like a veil. A few whispered that Elijah had died that night with Caleb, that the man walking the high country now wasn't really him, just some cold-weather ghost wearing his coat, carrying his lamp. Of course, none of that held water. Elijah bled like any man. He limped from an old riding injury. His hands bore frostbite scars from that first storm. But the myth had taken root, and the frontier was a place where stories filled the gaps that facts left behind. By the late 1840s, his name had reached the edge of the Great Plains. Settlers heading west stopped in trading posts and asked if the Lantern Man had passed through. Trappers in Idaho built shelters based on descriptions sketched from memory. Even the army took note. In one account, a lieutenant stationed at Fort Bridger wrote in his report, "A certain civilian, Elijah McGraw by name, has demonstrated remarkable proficiency in high-elevation winter survival. His techniques warrant further study." Elijah never gave the army what they wanted. When a captain offered him a commission to teach his methods formally, Elijah declined. "If you need a soldier," he said, "I'm the wrong man. If you want to keep your boys breathing, listen close while I talk." He gave them one lesson, just one. He showed them how to build a 5-man shelter using only canvas, snow blocks, and 3 lanterns. He demonstrated how to angle the vents, how to heat stones and place them for radiant warmth, how to cycle watches so each man had a turn closest to the heat. Then he left. The captain tried to recreate it weeks later. 2 soldiers died. They hadn't followed the instructions exactly. That was when Elijah added something new to his notes, a warning scrawled in uneven script. "Half a shelter is no shelter. Cut corners, dig graves." He kept refining, always refining. In the winter of '48, a smallpox outbreak struck a remote valley west of Lander. The snow was too deep for doctors to reach. The sick were sealed inside their cabins, heat fading fast. Elijah arrived alone, carrying a pack full of lanterns, oil, and folded blueprints. He helped them build sealed recovery rooms, tiny heat-trapping huts where sick bodies could rest without freezing. 4 out of 5 survived. That spring, someone asked why he'd risked infection. He shrugged. "A man freezing is a man dying slow. A fever man's dying fast. I figured they'd meet in the middle if I didn't help." He lived that way for years, drifting, fixing, teaching, never resting long, never calling any place home. But through it all, he kept his journals, stacks of them. By the Time he was 50, he'd filled 6 ledger books with everything he knew about cold. One was just dedicated to materials, ranked by insulation value, water resistance, weight. Another was filled with case studies, situations where his methods worked and where they didn't. One entire volume was titled simply, Things Fire Cannot Do. Those notebooks became his legacy. In 1852, Elijah disappeared for over a year. Some assumed he was dead. A storm had hit the Gros Ventre Mountains, and no one who rode in after it came back. But the next spring, a trapper stumbled into a trading post near Jackson's Hole with frostbitten fingers and a story. He'd been caught in the blizzard, dug into a drift, no food, no light, was ready to die when he saw it, a faint orange glow moving across the ridge. It stopped near him. A man's voice told him to stay still, not to breathe too fast. The light got closer, then canvas covered him, and warmth seeped in. He swore Elijah pulled him from the snow, built a shelter in minutes, and stayed with him 3 days. When he was safe, Elijah left, but not before tucking something into the man's coat, a notebook, the first volume of his writings. Written in Elijah's hand, it started with one line, "You don't fight the cold, you trick it." That notebook would eventually reach a frontier doctor named Harlan Voss, who made copies and passed them along to homesteaders crossing the Oregon Trail. Later, the Army would claim it was non-standard engineering, but adopt several of its principles in survival manuals. A few called it folk wisdom, others called it bush science. But those who'd ever faced death in snow called it something else, salvation. Yet despite his growing legend, Elijah remained elusive. In every account, he arrived alone and left quietly, never stayed longer than necessary, never asked for payment. Some tried to track his movements, but it was impossible. He'd ride out of one valley before his name had finished echoing in it. Then, in the winter of 1856, he returned to Goose Ridge, the place where it all began. Old ranch hands said they saw him walking along the ridgeline just before the snow came, lantern in hand, same coat, same iron ring. He didn't speak to anyone, just nodded once at a distant porch light and vanished into the hills. 3 weeks later, a young cowhand found a shelter buried in the snow near the site of the old draw. Inside was a body, seated, peaceful, wrapped in canvas and blankets, the rusted lantern at its feet. It was Elijah. Next to him were 2 things, a stone, smooth, warm to the touch despite the cold, and a final notebook bound in leather and marked simply, "The Last Fire." The journal was bound in thin, weather-softened leather and fastened with a strip of rawhide tied in a square knot. The cover had no title, only a circle etched with a crosshatch pattern, the symbol Elijah McGraw had started using in his later years when marking shelters or diagrams. It was a simple sigil, but unmistakable. Those who'd traveled with him or listened close knew what it meant. Warmth trapped, heat remembered, life held in still air. When the cowhand who found Elijah's body carried that journal back to the Draper Ranch, no one opened it for 3 days. Out of respect, out of fear, some thought it should be buried with him. Others thought it might be cursed, that the man had gone so deep into the science of surviving cold that he'd brought something unnatural back with him. But in the end, it was the rancher's wife, Miriam Draper, who untied the knot and read the first page aloud by lamplight. It wasn't what they expected. No diagrams, no survival techniques, not at first, just words written in a slow, deliberate hand, the handwriting of a man who had something final to say. "This isn't a book about cold, it's a book about memory. Cold is only what we feel when heat leaves too fast. Just like sorrow is what we feel when time outruns love." The room went silent after that. The fire crackled, someone coughed, a dog barked once outside, and Miriam kept reading. What followed wasn't a manual, it was something else, a reflection, a reckoning, a last attempt to explain not just the method, but the reason, the soul behind the science. In his final winter, Elijah hadn't just written about how to survive. He wrote about what survival cost and what it meant to carry warmth, literal and figurative, across the long, bitter nights of life. The second page listed names, a simple list, under a heading that read, "Those the cold took first." Caleb Barnes, January 1842, Jacob Weller, December 1844, Crow Eyes, Lakota Scout, Winter 1845, Anna Hollis, February 1847, age 9, Miles Dugan, January 1849, Baptiste Laramie, Winter Unknown, body found near Snake River. Each name was followed by a short note, where they'd been found, what had failed. For Caleb he wrote, "Shelter held, warmth failed, oil ran out, I chose wrong." For Anna Hollis, "Family buried in drift. I was 3 days too late, found her wrapped around baby brother. He survived." It was clear Elijah remembered every face, every detail, and those memories shaped the second section of the book. Here, he returned to his notes, but not like before. These were not scribbled field tests or margin sketches. They were organized, indexed, deliberate, a full treatise on frontier thermodynamics, written not with the jargon of an academic but the fierce clarity of a man who'd tested every word with blood and breath. He broke it down into chapters. Chapter 1, Heat Movement in Confined Spaces. Chapter 2, Human Breath as a Warmth Source. Chapter 3, Snow as Barrier and Blanket. Chapter 4, Radiant Transfer from Lanterns and Stones. Chapter 5, Cold Saturation Points in the Human Body. Chapter 6, Shelter Shape, Size, and Orientation in Sub-Zero Conditions. Chapter 7, Materials most likely to be found or traded along the Western Trails. Each chapter read like instruction and story combined. He didn't just write what to do, he explained why and when not to. Under a sketch of a cone-shaped tent with a lantern suspended near the apex, he wrote, "This form traps heat but rises it too fast. For one man, better to crawl. Let warmth settle around lungs, not rise to rafters." Under a list of stones, he added, "Basalt holds heat. River rocks burst if wet. Choose carefully. Warmth that explodes is no comfort at all." And beneath a section on breath condensation and carbon dioxide buildup, he simply scrawled, "Two men in a sealed pocket need 2 air holes, one to breathe, one to hope." These weren't just instructions, they were witness. He'd lived these lessons, failed some, bled for others. Every piece of knowledge was steeped in hard-won experience. But there was something else running through the pages too, a tone that hadn't been there before, a deep ache, regret maybe, or fear that what he knew would die with him if he didn't pass it on the right way. And then came chapter 8, What Fire Cannot Do. This was the soul of the book. No charts, no drawings, just paragraphs that read more like philosophy than fieldwork. Fire consumes. That's its nature. We think it warms because we gather near, but it only lasts as long as the wood or the will. A man can feed fire his life and still die cold, but light knows how to linger. A lantern gives without roaring. It remembers. It reflects. It's not just fuel, it's focus. And later, most men fear dying cold because it feels like vanishing. But I've seen men burn and vanish just as fast. Heat is not life. Contained heat is. The kind you tend, the kind you protect, the kind you share like a secret. No one in the room could speak when Miriam Draper finished that chapter. One of the younger hands, who'd never known Elijah beyond the stories, whispered, "It's like he knew he wasn't coming back." No one corrected him. The final section was short, just a few pages. It had no title, only a line at the top. "In the event, this is my last shelter." It detailed his final shelter design in exact measurements. The angles, the materials, the ideal weight of the rocks, the oil blend for best burn in low oxygen. It was everything he'd learned boiled into one last gift, a design perfected not for comfort but for endurance, for hope. At the end he'd drawn a circle, the same crosshatch symbol from the cover. Inside it, in tight script, "Let the warmth stay even when I'm gone." That line became a kind of motto for those who read the journal. Over the next few years, copies began to circulate. Some were full transcriptions, others were abridged, just the chapters with the instructions. But the last page was always preserved, always copied in full. By the winter of 1857, Elijah McGraw had been dead nearly a year, but his methods were spreading faster than any settler caravan could ride. In Oregon, an entire wagon train survived a mountain freeze by building shelters from his design. In Montana, a winter preacher began teaching the Lantern Gospel, sermons not of fire and brimstone, but of survival, endurance, and light preserved against the dark. And then the unexpected happened. One of Elijah's journals, the 3rd volume, was found in a sod house abandoned on the edge of Nebraska Territory. Alongside it, a crude mechanical device, a small rotating fan attached to a copper coil, and a polished tin mirror. It was mounted inside a wooden box with a lantern hook. Scribbled on the base were the words, "Heat turns wind, wind moves light. Light stays longer this way." No one fully understood it. Some thought it was a heater, others said it was a signal device. But one engineer traveling with the rail survey team wrote in his journal, "The man had stumbled upon the beginnings of convective cycling in closed systems. He was building frontier thermodynamics from scraps." In Washington Territory, word reached a fur trader who'd once met Elijah. He'd called the man mad at the time. Now, he wrote a letter to his brother. "We called him crazy for trusting a lamp. Now, men live who would have died without it. Maybe the world needed a little of his madness." And so the legend of McGraw's lantern wasn't just a story now. It was an idea, a framework, a legacy that settlers, scientists, and survivalists began building upon. But with fame came danger. In 1859, a man claiming to have discovered the lantern shelter tried to patent Elijah's design, said it was his innovation, that he'd built it years earlier. The case reached Denver's territorial court, and for once, witnesses came forward. Old cowhands, trappers, women and men whose lives had been saved by the shelter. One woman held up a copy of the final journal and read, "You don't fight the cold, you trick it." The case was dismissed, and the man was never heard from again. To this day, Parts of Elijah McGraw's work remain part of cold weather training for backcountry guides. Survivalists reference his stone warming methods. Old trappers pass down his shelter geometry. In some remote cabins, lanterns still hang near the roof with small metal boxes beneath. Stones warmed not by fire, but by memory. And in certain high valleys, when snow comes hard and fast, there are those who swear they still see it. A faint orange light drifting through the white, steady and low to the ground, like someone carrying warmth in their hand. They call it McGraw's lantern. By the time the Civil War lit the eastern states in fire and blood, Elijah McGraw had been gone nearly a decade. He never lived to see what came after, how the great western migration picked up its pace like a river bursting through spring ice. But his words, his diagrams, and the crude symbol he'd carved into journals and shelter frames, the cross-hatched circle, spread like seeds in wind. The myth of McGraw's lantern might have faded like most frontier stories, swallowed by newer wars, railroads, and the slow creep of cities westward. But something unusual happened. His ideas didn't just live on, they adapted. They took root in places he'd never seen, among people who'd never known his name until the moment they needed to. One family in particular, the Braithwaites, owed their very lives to a lantern, a box of stones, and a copied page torn from Elijah's final notebook. Their story begins in the brutal winter of 1871. Samuel and Marjorie Braithwaite had come from Missouri with their 2 sons and a wagon full of dreams. They'd settled in the Elk Fork Basin, a cold, windswept stretch of land east of the Bighorns, mostly untouched save for trappers and the occasional surveyor. They had a sod house, 1 cow, and enough supplies to last the winter if they rationed carefully. The place was raw, lonely, and bitter cold by early November, but they were determined. Like so many settlers, they'd traded safety for the promise of land, freedom, and something of their own. Then came the storm. It began with black clouds on the western horizon, low, thick, and silent. The wind dropped to nothing. Birds vanished. Even the dog refused to go outside. The first snow fell just after dusk, heavy and wet. By morning, the door was sealed shut. Snow drifted 5 feet against the south wall. Then the wind came. It howled across the prairie like judgment. The sod house groaned. The seams leaked cold like open wounds. The fireplace struggled, smoke curling back down the flue. Samuel tried to keep the fire going, but the woodpile was buried. The cow bawled until its voice went hoarse. The boys cried from the cold, from the hunger, from fear. On the second day, the fire died. They were trapped, and the temperature inside the house dropped fast. Breath fogged, water jugs turned to ice, and fingers began to lose feeling. Marjorie bundled the boys together under every blanket they owned, but it wasn't enough. That's when Samuel remembered the book. He'd found it months earlier in a trading post near Fort Fetterman, a worn leather-bound journal missing its cover, sold for a nickel. The trader said it came from a doctor's estate, part of a box of wilderness survival books. Samuel had flipped through it once, saw crude diagrams, strange phrases about pocket shelters and heat memory, and filed it away as mountain man ramblings. But now, shivering on the earthen floor of his frozen home, with his children fading fast, he tore through their storage box until he found it. The pages were warped, edges frayed, but the drawings were intact. One showed a circle with a lantern, a ring of stones, and a low canvas dome. Underneath it read, 3 hours of burn, 12 hours of warmth. Shape holds the heat. Breath seals it. Stones remember. He flipped ahead. Another page showed how to insulate beneath, straw or leaves, if canvas wasn't available. A paragraph on using oilskin or even flour sacks soaked in rendered fat to block wind. And most important, where to place the light, how to keep the shelter small, how to let the human body do half the work. Samuel didn't hesitate. He pushed the table aside, cleared the floor. He pulled the flour sacks down from the rafters, dumped the contents, and stitched them together with twine. He broke apart a chair, split it, used the slats to form a loose dome frame. He packed dirt and straw around the edges. He brought every smooth stone from their hearth and placed them near the last few coals to heat. Marjorie helped without asking questions. She wrapped the children in shirts, coats, anything dry. Samuel placed the lantern, their last bit of kerosene inside, in the center of the frame. The stones went into a tin pail nearby. The sack dome was lowered, tucked tight. Then they crawled in. At first nothing, then warmth, faint but real, a whisper of heat against bare skin. The boys stopped crying. Marjorie began to breathe evenly. Samuel held them close and didn't sleep, afraid the flame would die, afraid it was only false hope. But the light held, and the heat stayed. They spent 2 nights inside that makeshift shelter. When the lantern guttered out, the warm stones still radiated life. When frost coated the walls of the sod house, their little dome stayed clear. And when the storm finally passed, and Samuel dug out the door, sunlight hit his face, and steam rose from their breath like victory. He credited the book, no hesitation. In spring, when they returned to town for supplies, He asked the trader about the journal. Who wrote it? The man shrugged. Old story, belonged to a mountain man. Some say he survived the blizzard of 42 with nothing but a lantern and a few rocks. Samuel bought the entire crate of papers that had come with it, spent weeks transcribing them, left copies at the fort, gave one to the school teacher, even sent one east with a passing missionary. He never forgot, neither did his children. By 1880, those copied notes had made it into pamphlets, mimeographed, passed along by scouts and railroad men, tucked into the back pages of church newsletters and general store catalogs. The title varied: Frontier Cold Practices, Winter Wisdom from the High Country, The Lantern Shelter. But every version traced its origins to a weathered journal marked with a circle and crosshatch. Some thought it was a folktale, others treated it as gospel, but the method worked. In 1887, a mining camp near Deadwood faced a 3-day whiteout. The men couldn't run their boilers, and the shaft entrances froze over. One prospector, a former cavalry scout, remembered the shelter trick. He had a sheet of canvas and a hand lantern. He taught the others how to build heat pockets in the bunkhouse. They all survived. In 1891, a blizzard hit a train halfway through Sherman Pass. With no wood for fire, the passengers built shelters inside the cars using bed sheets, hot bricks from the oven, and lanterns placed strategically. When rescuers arrived, they found the cars cold but survivable. One man credited a Cowboy's book he'd read years earlier in his uncle's library. Each story echoed back to Elijah McGraw. The symbol he used, the crosshatch circle, became a shorthand for safety. Trappers scratched it onto trees where they'd left emergency shelters. Prospectors painted it on rock faces near supply caches. By 1900, wilderness guides began using it as a trail marker for winter routes. But not all uses were noble. As McGraw's legend grew, opportunists emerged. In 1902, a hardware company began selling McGraw's Arctic lamp, a thick glass lantern that claimed to hold the flame of salvation against any storm. It was gaudy, heavy, and useless. The design ignored Elijah's core principles: containment, reflection, thermal mass. It burned hot and wasteful, drawing in cold air faster than it could repel. A wilderness teacher named Josiah Mott wrote a scathing letter to a regional paper. Elijah McGraw didn't survive by burning brighter. He survived by burning smarter. Anyone who sells heat without memory insults the very man they claim to honor. The backlash grew. McGraw's name became a litmus test. If you used it to profit, you were a grifter. If you used it to survive, you were keeping the legacy. By 1910, as national parks began formalizing ranger stations and cold weather shelters, Elijah's techniques were quietly adopted into manuals, not always credited, but always present. Shelters built low, narrow, and sealed at the base. Lanterns suspended mid-chamber, never at the entrance. Stones heated and used as radiant buffers. Breath-managed ventilation, slow, rhythmic respiration to prevent condensation and hypoxia. Some guides wrote McGraw style in the margins of their instructions. Others didn't name it at all, just said it worked, and that was enough. But even as the world modernized, even as new fuels and technologies emerged, there remained places where none of that mattered, where batteries failed, fires were dangerous, and the only thing that stood between life and death was how well you could trap the heat you had. And in those places, the old ways lived on. In 1933, a young hiker caught in a freak snowstorm near the Tetons wrote in her journal, "I remembered something my grandfather told me about a man with a lantern and a box of rocks. I thought it was just a story, but I built the shelter. I lived." That journal, later published, revived interest again. Cold weather researchers reached back into archives. Old notebooks were unearthed from attics and libraries. McGraw's final journal became required reading at survival courses across Montana and Wyoming. By the 1950s, a reprint of his writings, compiled under the title The Last Fire, Writings of Elijah McGraw, was printed in limited run. It never sold widely, but in the shelves of Forest Service offices, mountaineering schools, and backcountry ranger cabins, it was treated with quiet reverence. The circle with the crosshatch became a kind of secret badge, a nod among those who understood what it meant to face the cold not with brute force, but with respect, calculation, and the stubborn belief that a man with nothing but a lantern and a little knowledge could outlast the worst nature had to offer. And through it all, the blizzards, the wars, the progress, the question remained: how had one cowboy figured it all out? What had driven him to keep refining the same idea? Not just a method for survival, but a philosophy of endurance, of passing on warmth long after the fire had gone out. The answer, as always, lay not in the shelters or stones, but in the boy he couldn't save. Elijah McGraw's story, if left only to the tales passed around campfires or the instructional pamphlets penned decades after his death, might have seemed like the work of a cold-weather savant, a man who studied nature like a book, cracked the code of survival through sheer grit and logic, and gave the world a gift in return. But the truth, the full truth of what drove him, lay hidden under the weight of frost and memory, buried not in diagrams or warming stones, but in a boy's grave and a man's guilt. Long before his name became legend, Elijah had been just another cowboy, quiet, competent, a little strange around the edges, but not mad, not obsessed. That came later, in the aftermath of one decision, one mistake, one cold night when he placed a lantern 2 feet too far to the left and woke up to a body cooling in his arms. Caleb Barnes had been his responsibility, a young ranch hand eager to prove himself, eager to live, and he died whispering the words, "We're not gonna die, are we?" into a storm that didn't care. The world called Elijah a hero for surviving that night, but he never wore the word well, because in his mind, he hadn't survived, not really. Part of him had frozen there beside Caleb in that lantern-lit cocoon of canvas and hope, and the rest of him had spent every winter since trying to warm that frozen piece back to life. Few people knew what happened in the weeks after the blizzard of 42. Most assumed Elijah returned to the Draper Ranch, rebuilt his gear, and moved on like the rest of them. But there was a period, 10, maybe 12 days, where no one saw him. No one could say where he'd gone. Only scraps of the truth survived, pieced together years later from letters, hearsay, and one half-burned journal page found behind the hearth of an abandoned trapper's shack in Dry Bone Canyon. That page, creased and smudged with soot, bore only a few sentences. In Elijah's hand, "I lit the flame, I set the stones, I breathed slow, I told him we'd live, I was wrong." What followed those words was scratched out so deeply the page was torn. The man who returned from that exile wasn't the same one who'd vanished. Elijah had always been a loner, but now he became spectral. He stopped sleeping indoors, turned down warm meals. When others gathered around the fire, he stayed back, lantern in hand, eyes fixed on the snow line. And when he spoke, which was rare, it was only to correct someone's shelter technique or offer a better way to vent heat without losing air. He spoke like a man trying to rewrite history one diagram at a time, and somewhere along the line he stopped talking about the cold as something to be feared. He began talking about it like an old adversary, a thing that tested you, waited for your mistakes, then moved in. "Cold don't kill," he said once to a greenhorn who asked why he wouldn't start a fire like everyone else. "It listens. It waits till you think you've outsmarted it. Then it taps your shoulder when your guard's down." Most folks wrote that off as eccentricity, but others saw the truth behind it. Elijah wasn't just surviving. He was battling something, and he was losing piece by piece, each winter claiming more of him. By the late 1840s, he'd stopped carrying anything but his saddle, a bedroll, 2 lanterns, and a satchel filled with wax-sealed notebooks. He spoke less, smiled never, but his presence was still sought. When a storm came down from the high peaks, men rode 20 miles just to ask him how to prepare. When a mother lost 2 children to frostbite and feared for her third, she rode to Elijah's camp alone and begged him to help. He said nothing, just packed his stones, his oil, and followed her back. The child lived, and though he never spoke to the mother again after that day, she later said, "That man didn't walk into our cabin. He brought the warmth in with him, like it clung to him, like he was made of it." But those who saw him up close knew that wasn't true. In truth, Elijah was thinning out, not in body, though he grew gaunt, but in spirit, like a man whose fire had been running low for a long time, and who had forgotten what it meant to feel warmth for himself. He gave it away too freely, stored it in rocks and left it behind, passed it on in notebooks, and never kept enough to fuel his own breath. He became, in every way that mattered, the lantern itself, built to burn quietly, steadily, until the oil ran out. There were sightings in the years that followed, always alone, always at the edge of storms. One woman swore she saw him standing on a ridge above her cabin as her chimney collapsed in the wind. She said the light from his lantern cut through the snow like a path, even though no flame should have been visible at that distance. When rescuers arrived the next day, she pointed to the ridge. There were no tracks, just a small stone buried in the snow, still warm to the touch. Another account came from a boy, barely 8, who'd gotten separated from his family during a freak squall while they were moving cattle through a canyon pass. He claimed a thin man with a glowing belt found him, wrapped him in canvas, and made him breathe slow inside a cave. When the storm passed, the boy was found unharmed, curled around a smooth iron ring etched with the McGraw symbol. The boy didn't remember his own name at first, but he remembered the man's. "Elijah," he said. "He told me to follow the warmth, that it always goes somewhere." And perhaps that was the problem. Elijah always followed the warmth away, toward others, toward danger, toward the cold places where no one else wanted to go. He never let it return to him, never let it stay. In his later years, some say Elijah began walking with a limp, an old injury flaring from decades of cold joints and saddle wear. Others said it was frostbite, slow and creeping, claiming toes one by one until he rode with his boots stuffed with wool and silence. But he never complained, never asked for help. When asked if he ever got tired of wandering, he replied, "Some men build fences, I build warmth. Trouble is, warmth don't stay put." That became his final quote in most of the print retellings. It's carved on a plaque outside an old ranger station in the Bighorns. But the sentence that followed it, recorded only once in a letter from a teacher named Viola Hart, who interviewed him in 1854, never made it to print. "I thought if I could build it right, one time, just once, it'd stay, and maybe Caleb wouldn't be so quiet anymore." That was the moment she realized. Elijah McGraw wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to resurrect. Not in the biblical sense, not in madness, but in memory. Trying to bring Caleb's voice back into the world by building a space warm enough to hold it. That belief shaped his final years. He stopped refining the shelters after 1855, said there wasn't anything left to improve. Instead, he focused on spreading the knowledge, left journals in saddlebags at trading posts, gave pages away to mothers, scratched instructions on the walls of abandoned line shacks. At one post, a clerk said he watched Elijah carve the full geometry of a lantern shelter into the underside of a table with nothing but a pocket knife. When asked why, he said, "Wood rots, ink fades, but a man waiting out a storm with nothing but a lantern and time will check under a table. You bet." He knew where desperation lived, and he left breadcrumbs there. By 1856, he'd made his way back to Goose Ridge, the site of that first blizzard, the place where Caleb had died. No one saw him go. No one knew why. But when a young cowhand found his body 3 weeks later, seated in a completed lantern shelter, wrapped in wool and canvas, it was clear Elijah hadn't just wandered into the cold and quit. He'd built his end. The shelter was perfect. A low dome, packed snow, vented, insulated, the lantern suspended over the warm box. Beside him were the final journal and a single smooth stone, still faintly warm. There was no note, no farewell, just a drawing carved into the stone with a knife point, the McGraw symbol, and beneath it, a line no one had ever seen in his writing before. "He sleeps warm now." The journals left behind confirmed what many had long suspected, that every tweak, every test, every rebuild had been done in Caleb's name, not to forgive himself. Elijah never believed he could, but to ensure no one else made the same mistake. His obsession had never been about invention, it had always been about redemption. And that's why, even now, long after the frontier days have passed, even after electricity and central heating and GPS and satellite weather reports, there are still those who remember, still those who carry a smooth stone in their bag, still those who scratch the circle with crosshatch into cabin walls, or carve it into pine near trails that vanish in snow, because the cold hasn't changed. But neither has Elijah's answer. Long after Elijah McGraw's body was laid to rest beneath the same stretch of frozen dirt that had taken Caleb Barnes so many years earlier, the story of his final shelter spread outward in concentric circles, from cowhand to rancher, from ranger to homesteader, from teacher to scout. But unlike so many legends that stretch and warp with time, his didn't grow with exaggeration. It shrank, distilled down into something simpler, something cleaner. Not a man who fought the cold, but a man who listened to it. And in that act of listening, Elijah gave the world something it had never asked for, but would come to depend on, again and again. A way to survive when nothing should have been survivable. A method built not from bravado, but from humility. Not from fire and fury, but from silence and understanding. By the 1880s, the name Elijah McGraw had slipped out of the headlines, if it had ever been there to begin with. He was never interviewed by dime novelists, never sought by photographers, never invited east to sit in some gentleman's parlor and recount his tales. He wouldn't have gone if he'd been asked. Instead, his name surfaced only when the cold came fast and hard, and someone needed to remember how to hold the line between life and death, with nothing but cloth, oil, and a handful of warm stones. In those moments, his name mattered, and still does. When the Great Blizzard of 1888 swept across the plains, it was said that more than a dozen school teachers used makeshift lantern shelters to keep their students alive through the night. One account from Nebraska described a teacher named Clara Hutchins, who remembered a drawing her father had once shown her: a low dome, a lantern, a tin box with hot rocks. She replicated it inside the schoolhouse with curtains, chalkboards, and bricks from the stove. Every child lived. She later wrote in her diary, "I had no idea if it would work, only that a cowboy once died trying to perfect it. I figured a man who died for a trick deserved the chance to save a few more." The journal was found years later tucked behind a wallboard during a renovation. It still smelled faintly of kerosene. In 1913, when an Arctic outbreak stranded a mail train outside Cheyenne, a conductor named Ellis Grant instructed passengers to hang their lanterns low, pile blankets over seating benches, and seal every window crack with wet newspapers. It wasn't in the official training manual. When asked where he'd learned the technique, he simply said, "An old cowpoke drew it in the back of a saloon once." Said he owed his life to a light that never gave up. One of those passengers later painted the scene. A car filled with orange glow, people huddled tight under blankets, breath misting gently as the storm roared outside. In the foreground, a single lantern, burning low, steady, brave. He titled it McGraw's Flame. Even into the 20th century, wilderness manuals, especially those distributed in Alaska and the Canadian North, quietly carried echoes of Elijah's principles. His name rarely appeared, but his ideas were everywhere. Snow as insulation, airflow managed by breath, heat retained in mass, not fire. Even the language mirrored his voice. Don't fight the storm, work with it. Don't waste the heat you make. Trap it, shape it, share it. It wasn't long before mountain rescue teams in Colorado and Montana began integrating lantern cells into emergency protocols. Small, collapsible chambers made from reflective fabric and heating stones that could be deployed in minutes. They were used to great effect during a freak cold snap in 1949 that killed hundreds of cattle and froze entire convoys in place. Rangers credited the cells with saving dozens of lives. One report read, "This method appears primitive but effective, a testament to early frontier ingenuity. Source unknown, possibly McGraw, possibly. But for those who'd ever huddled in the dark with a lantern and a prayer, there was no doubt." Then, of course, came the day that Elijah's story nearly vanished. In the early 1960s, as federal agencies moved towards standardizing wilderness survival training, there was a brief push to consolidate knowledge under modern frameworks, to discard folk techniques in favor of scientific consensus. One bureaucrat labeled McGraw's ideas romantic nonsense, citing a lack of formal documentation, reproducible experiments, and academic rigor. But before the erasure could take root, an old forest ranger named Walter Prine, retired, half-deaf and forgotten by most, stood before the commission in a wool coat and scuffed boots, holding up a battered notebook. It had belonged to his father, who'd worked alongside Elijah in 1850. He read from the final page, "He sleeps warm now." Then Walter said, "You call it nonsense. I call it legacy. This book kept 4 generations of my family alive. You want to toss it in the trash? You better toss me in after it." They didn't toss him, or the book. In fact, they listened. And slowly, Elijah's ideas began filtering back into the fold, not as folklore, but as verified survival technique. Modern engineers even confirmed the thermal efficiency of the lantern shelter design in controlled tests. It didn't take much, just a bit of heat, a bit of mass, and a place for it all to sit quietly, contained. Just like Elijah said, by the 1980s, replicas of his shelters had been constructed in outdoor museums across the northern states. Guides walked visitors through them, explaining how a single flame, properly shielded and supported, could extend life for days. Children crawled inside and felt the difference. Outside was cold, but inside, even without a fire, there was a whisper of comfort. That whisper was the sound of Elijah McGraw, still speaking. And even now, in a world of insulated gear and GPS signals, his voice carries. In 2021, a solo skier named Amanda Cho was caught in a whiteout in the Beartooths. Her communications failed. Her tent collapsed. She had one heat pack, a tea candle, and a small metal bowl. But she also had a memory of a diagram once shared in a survival seminar showing how to use snow as walls, breath as insulation, and a candle to warm a dome no taller than your knees. She built it. She lived. When asked later if it was luck, she shook her head. "No," she said. "It was Elijah. I never met him, but I met what he left behind. And that is the final legacy." Because in all the stories, the saved children, the surviving trains, the lanterns burning bright inside snow caves, what mattered most wasn't the technique. It wasn't even the survival. It was the intent. Elijah McGraw never tried to be a hero. He never sought fame or reward or even recognition. He tried to save one boy, and when he failed, he spent the rest of his life making sure no one else had to fail the same way. He gave the frontier something rare, not a weapon, not a tool, but a way, a mindset, a memory that could be built in cloth and stone, passed hand to hand, lit like a flame that never truly died out. And in the end, that's all any man can hope for. Not to be remembered by name, but to be remembered by deed. So the next time snow drifts high against your window, and the world goes silent and white, light a lantern, place a warm stone by your side, and know that somewhere, in the great hush of winter, a cowboy rides still, not toward fire, but away from it, bearing warmth into the coldest places, one small flame at a time.